Hi, I'm Gary Miller. I made the following video for the Thames Valley Wood Turning Guild here in London, Ontario. It was for a Zoom meeting. It's all about how I turn end grain bowls and some of the differences between that and the conventional side grain bowls. I hope you find it interesting. Incidentally, sometime during the course of the video you'll hear me refer to a machinist's drill as a chuck. Senior's moment, ignore it. Turning an end grain bowl isn't all that different from turning a side grain bowl. Basically, the side grain, you contour the outside the way you want it, and you remount it, you hollow it out on the inside, and you're doing the same thing with essentially the same thing with an end grain bowl. The big difference is where you start. On your conventional side grain bowl, you've got a stump, you cut it in half, you get the pith out of it, and then you cut your bowl blank out of this slab from the side, such as this. This is ready to go on the lathe. It's not cut nice and round, but I just knocked the edges off with a chainsaw. However, a piece of aromatic cedar, rather than cutting this pith out and cutting and turning it from the side slab, you turn it from the end. Main reason being is the color differential between the contrast between the sapwood and the heartwood. This doesn't look all that spectacular right now because it's covered with several coats of wax emulsion. However, when this is finished, it's a beautiful red and it just pops. So that's what we're going to do tonight, and if you have any questions, we'll deal with them later on. Here's an example of what I'm intending to do today. It's basically a piece of aromatic cedar that's turned end grain. The objective being to get the most benefits from the color and configuration of the perimeter, etc. Initially, we want to face off both ends of the piece of log, so to select the best coloration, grain structure, and perimeter configuration. I've already done one end, so I'm going to face off the other end right now. I set the tool rest at right angles to the bed, and then incidentally, notice it's a variable speed lathe, so I started at low speed and bring it up to the appropriate speed. I use a very sharp spindle gouge to do the face-off cut. It's better than a parting tool because you don't get any tear out from it. You get a nice clean cut. So when you're finished the cut, you can get a real good sense of what the final face will look like. Now you get a real good sense of the color and shape of the log and the contrast between the hardwood and the sapwood. As I said, I had already done the other end, so I can compare the two ends now and decide which one I wanted to face up, i.e. the open part of the bowl. And I will remount the blank to make a chuck spigot on the opposite end of the part I want face up, of course. I'll skip all of the turning part of that because it's pretty straightforward. Don't want this thing to go on forever. So I've got it mounted in the chuck here, and then I'm going to drill a pilot hole in the face of the bowl here, which will do two things for me. First of all, it'll determine I will determine the depth of the cut, depth of the bowl is actually going to be. Not a deep bowl, it's only about 3.5 inches in finished height. The other thing is when you're turning end grain, it's not quite the same thing as turning side grain. You have to cut from the center out in order to get the grain support you need when you're hollowing out the bowl. Normally you'd start from the outside in a side grain bowl so that you have support from the grain, but in this case it's the opposite. Incidentally, that's a machining chuck with a number 3 taper on it, so I just have to pop it into my tailstock and I'm all ready to go. I don't have to worry about chucks and things. Now, out of necessity, I'll be covering up parts of this, the face of this thing as I hollow the end of it. This is a one-man show, so I can't move the camera around while I'm doing this. You want to start from the center. You're using the flute towards you, and your tool is at maybe 45 degrees, thereabouts. And we'll see as we go along a little bit how the hollowing process progresses. Sorry about the fact that it's somewhat covered up, but you can see there's some exposure there. Skipping forward, I get to the depth that I want, and having done the inside first is a little odd, because when I would do a side grain bowl, I would do the outside of the bowl and then remount it and hollow it to follow the same form. But in this case, the real show part of this thing is the inside of the bowl, the face-up side. So I wanted to get that right first, and then I'll carry on to do the exterior of the bowl. So right now, I'm actually creating a bit of an ogee here. I'm hollowing from the base out towards the outer edge or outer perimeter of the stalk. Of course, you're cutting air there because you've got spaces between each of those flutes on the convoluted shape. So it has to be done with some care. You can't get too aggressive when you get toward those edges. I'll take a little more off the face there because there's still some rough wood. I'm cutting against the grain a little bit here, not because it's the ideal thing to do, but I found that this aromatic cedar is surprisingly hard and will take that kind of a cut without too much damage. And I just wanted to get the basic shape going before I do the final cuts on it. You don't want to take deep cuts when you're doing that because you are going into end grain and you could get a nasty catch. So make sure you're riding your bevel all the way and progress slowly. As you can see by the sheen on the wood there, that's actually a very clean cut, even though it's against the grain. I'm using a big, heavy scraper right now to do the final cut on there. Just to take any minor irregularities that have come up on it. It's a round nose scraper. This is another one that I'm using, probably a little better suited than the one I just used. Similar thing, a little slightly different shape. This is called a negative rake scraper because it actually has a bevel on the top as well, so I can come straight across without having to raise the handle and not be concerned about getting catches. Nice clean cut. Now I can start shaping the exterior. I use a cap that I made for my live center with a bit of foam on it to add additional support to the workpiece while I'm working on the perimeter there. It allows me to do fairly heavy cuts. I'll start off with using a 1/2 inch bowl gouge. I'm taking fairly light cuts because of the deep flutes on the sides of the bowl, or the sides of the stalk. And then when I get into it a bit, I will switch over to a 5/8 inch to give me the ability to extend the tool over the tool rest farther with some confidence that it's going to be well supported. Now I've got the 5/8 bowl gouge there. Measuring the depth of the bowl from the inside to make sure that the outside is not going to be shorter than the inside. Just to confirm about wall thickness and depth and so forth, because this is a rough, will be a rough blank because it's still wet, so it has to be dried before I can do the finish cutting on it. At this point, I'm going to create a new chuck spigot on the back end of this thing and eliminate some of the stock. It's a little cumbersome the way it is right now, so I'm using a custom-made tool rest that allows me to get in close and don't have too much overhang this way. And then I'll just saw off the nub. No, I'm just going to put end sealer on both sides of the rough blank. Then I'll mount it in a bowl, into a box of silicate until it dries appropriately so I can do the finished turning on it. It took probably a better part of a month to dry. I tested it daily for moisture content. This is the silicate. I'm just removing it now to after having let it dry, so I can mount it for finished turning. So now I can remount the blank on the lathe for the finished turning. Once again, I'll use the negative rake scraper to finish off the inside. Just enough to give me fresh wood and to take any distortion that might have happened during the drying out of it. Once again, start at a low speed, bring it up to the speed you want for safety's sake. Light cuts. Make sure that curve is just exactly the way you want it. Once again, I'm mounting the live sander up against it for support when I start working on the exterior. Light cuts initially because there's the flutes and some distortion, so you don't want any chatter or grabbing or possible catches. As I get closer and closer to the edge that I want on the bowl, I will set the flute on the gouge so that it's perfectly vertical, so I get a nice clean cut through the bark as I move through to the depth of the cut. I'm looking for about 3/16 thickness. It is an end grain bowl, so there's much less strength in the edges of the bowl than there would be on a side grain bowl. So you can't go ultra thin with an end grain bowl, because if somebody lifts it up from the edge, it could actually break. They're mainly for aesthetics, not utilitarian use. These final cuts make them very light. Now I'm just checking for consistency and wall thickness. And just a little more off the edge and a little bit deeper into the flutes. And a little bit of shear cutting towards the bottom end there to eliminate any minor tear out that might have happened. There was actually very little. This aromatic cedar cuts so beautifully. Ready for sanding, and I'm starting with 120, and I'll work my way up to 400. Even though there are the fluted edges around that, you can sand it without fear of getting caught if you put the pressure on the lower side of the sandpaper, not a lot of pressure in any case, and roll the upper part away from it so that there's nothing for it to catch on. Now for more support, I'm using a piece of Velcro that's foam backed, and I'll go through the various thicknesses of grades of sandpaper. Right now I'm using Abernet, ranging from 180 all the way up to 400. Again, I'm lifting that upper edge so that I don't get caught into any of the flutes. Very little pressure. Similar on the outside. Nice thing about Abernet is it doesn't, when it starts to clog up, all you have to do is strip it off the Velcro and give it a slap against something or blast some air on it from your compressor, and cleans right out, so it doesn't bog down on you. You can keep it clean right until it's literally worn out. And it'll last a lot longer too. Again, I'm using my little narrow custom-made tool rest to cut it off from the mounting spigot. I'll take that down to about a 1/2 inch nub and then saw it off. Love my little pocket-sized Japanese saw. Now all I have to do is finish off the base. I've mounted it on my vacuum truck. I'm using the live center to support it during the initial finishing cuts on the base. Right now I'm using a very small 1/4 inch spindle gouge to countersink the base a little bit. I'll take it down to a tiny nub until there's virtually no lateral forces happening, then I'll remove the tail stock altogether for the final little cuts and after sanding. I've got the basic curvature that I want, removing the tailstock. Take the final little tip off of there. extend that curve right to the middle. Bevel always rubbing. And I'll do a light shear scrape to the whole surface right up to the edge, where I'll leave about an 1/8 inch foot around the perimeter. Nice to have a vacuum chuck. I feel a little spoiled. You could use jaws, you could use a variety of ways of doing it, but this is certainly the most convenient. Right now I'm incising two little grooves, about 3/16 of an inch apart. That will give me a place to sign it and date it, and it gives a finishing look to it. Have to go through the same sanding procedure. Make sure all surfaces of the bowl are sanded exactly the same and finished exactly the same. Once again, going from 120 right through to 400. That's the end of the story. I hope you enjoyed it. Until next time.